Welcome to my channel, the world of galactic legends and hidden romances. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because today's story will take you beyond the stars, into the heart of a forbidden bond between a human warrior and his alien servant. The galaxy had long been at war, empires rising and falling, 1,000 species fighting for power among the stars, and in the midst of all this chaos humanity stood small yet unbroken. They were not the strongest, not the tallest, not even the most advanced, but they were the ones who refused to kneel. Among them was Commander Kale Arden, a young warrior who had already earned a reputation that reached across the stars. His victories on battlefields had made alien rulers fear him, not because of his armies but because of the fire in his eyes, the refusal to submit, the courage that seemed almost unnatural. When Kale was finally captured after the siege of Iridian, many expected him to be dragged in chains, to finally break before the will of the Valari Dominion. The Valari were ancient, tall beings with shimmering skin like polished crystal and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. They were elegant and ruthless, ruling with a grace that hid cruelty behind silken words. To them, humans were nothing but servants, tools, or amusements, and when Kale stood before their emperor, the court expected him to kneel. But he did not. Even in chains, even surrounded by guards, Kale stared at the emperor with unflinching defiance. That single act unsettled them, for no human had ever dared show such pride. To break him, the Valari devised a cruel game. Instead of placing Kale among the slave ranks, they gave him something unexpected, an alien servant of his own. It was meant as humiliation, a way to mock him, to twist his spirit until he submitted. Her name was Lyra. She was young, her hair silver-white like threads of starlight, her violet eyes glowing softly beneath long lashes. She was trained to serve without hesitation, her movements graceful, her voice quiet, her will bent from childhood. When she was brought before Kale, she expected another arrogant warrior who would use her as others had. Yet when her gaze met his, she saw something different, something that unsettled her. He was human, and yet in his eyes burned defiance, not lust, not cruelty, but an unyielding fire. She whispered under her breath, "Why would they give a human me?" Kale, still bound in chains, gave her a smirk that unsettled her even further. "Looks like they don't know what to do with me either." From that moment, an invisible tension stretched between them. The first days were quiet. Lyra followed commands with mechanical precision, never questioning, never hesitating. But Kale did not treat her like the masters she knew. He did not bark orders, he did not demand her silence. Instead, he challenged her. "Look at me when I speak," he told her one night. She froze. For a Valari servant, raising her eyes without permission was rebellion, a punishable offense. Yet when she did, when her violet gaze finally rose to meet his, she felt her chest tighten. His eyes did not see her as property. His eyes saw her as a being, and that frightened her more than cruelty ever had. Days became weeks. Kale refused to bow, refused to act as though his fate was sealed, and his defiance began to break through the careful armor Lyra wore. She found herself questioning things she had never dared question before. Why were humans considered weak when this one seemed unshakable? Why did her people value obedience more than freedom? And why, when she brushed his hand by accident while pouring water, did her heart skip in a way it never had? She knew it was wrong. He was her charge, she was his servant. They were bound by chains set by others, yet the chains around her heart felt weaker each day. Late one evening, Kale caught her staring. His voice was low but sharp. "You keep looking at me like you're waiting for me to break." She flushed, unable to answer. He leaned closer, his gaze unwavering. "I won't. Not for them. Not for you. Not for anyone." The words sank deep into her chest. She had been bound to masters who demanded obedience, but never to someone who spoke of resistance. She felt her throat tighten, her lips part, but no answer came. She turned away, ashamed, yet unable to silence the truth forming in her heart. She did not want him to break either. Whispers spread through the Valari court. They had given a human a servant, expecting humiliation, and instead rumors began to grow that the servant looked at her master not with disdain but with something else. The nobles began to watch Kale closely. Some thought it amusing, others thought it dangerous, but all agreed that something about the human was different. One night, under the glass dome of the palace chamber where stars shone like diamonds, Lyra dared to ask, "Why do you keep fighting?" Kale leaned back, his jaw set, his voice steady. "Because if I stop, they've already won. And I don't like losing." The silence stretched long. She lowered her gaze, not out of obedience but out of fear that he would see the truth in her eyes, the truth that she no longer wanted him to lose either. The breaking point came sooner than expected. The Emperor wished to make a spectacle of Kale, to force him into submission before the entire court. They brought Lyra forward, ordering her to kneel before him and declare herself his property. Her voice trembled as she obeyed. "I belong to him." Gasps echoed through the chamber, though it was routine for servants to speak those words. What made it different was that this time it was a human, a prisoner, an enemy. The court expected Kale to smirk, to take pride in owning her. Instead, Kale bent down, lifted her chin with his calloused hand, and said loudly, "No. She belongs to no one." The chamber erupted in whispers and outrage. The Emperor's face twisted in fury. But in that moment, for the first time in her life, Lyra felt freedom. Not in chains broken, not in oaths released, but in words that shattered everything she had believed. She did not belong. She was not owned. She was herself. Her breath caught, her heart racing, and as she looked into Kale's eyes, she knew the truth. The human was unlike any being she had ever known. And deep within, something she had never dared to feel began to burn: hope. The silence after Kale's defiance lingered like a shadow across the Emperor's court, and though days passed, the memory of that moment refused to fade. Lyra moved through the palace halls with her head lowered, yet inside her something pulsed with fire. She had seen the chains fall from her spirit, though she dared not let the world know. But the world seemed to know anyway. The eyes of the Valari nobles followed her wherever she went, whispering among themselves, suspicion dripping from every word. They thought she had been tainted by the human's rebellion, that she had absorbed his defiance. And though she told herself she was still only a servant, she could not unsee the truth. Kale Arden had awakened something inside her that would never sleep again. Kale, meanwhile, endured his own quiet torment. He had humiliated the Emperor, a crime that could never be forgiven. His meals grew smaller, his guards harsher, the corners of his cell darker. Yet he felt lighter somehow, as if his spirit had been sharpened instead of dulled. The Valari wanted him broken, but he refused to give them the satisfaction. Every time he remembered Lyra's trembling voice, her eyes filled with a pain older than her years, he found new strength to stand taller, even in chains. But the Empire did not forgive, and the Emperor's anger grew heavy in the air. Soon, the summons came. Kale was to enter the arena. It was not justice, it was spectacle. A chance for the Valari to display his weakness, to remind all who watched that humanity was nothing compared to their might. When the day came, the arena walls shone like polished obsidian, towering high enough to blot out the stars. Lyra was forced to stand with the other servants, her hands trembling though she clasped them tight against her robes. The crowd thundered with anticipation, their voices like a living storm. Kale was dragged into the center, stripped of armor, his wrists still raw from the shackles. The guards tossed a single blade at his feet, a weapon far too small for the beast he would face. Across the arena, gates creaked open, and a champion of the Valari stormed forth. The creature towered 3 times Kale's height, its body a brutal mixture of muscle and cybernetic augmentation. Its roar shook the very ground, and the crowd screamed in delight. Kale picked up the blade, weighed it in his hand, and stared up at the monster. He felt the fear, but he did not let it own him. He had fought in wars before, but this was different. This was not just survival. This was defiance made flesh. The battle began with fury. The champion lunged, claws flashing, and Kale barely rolled aside. The sand exploded where he had stood a heartbeat earlier. Again and again the beast struck, and again Kale dodged, each movement fueled not by strength but by sheer will. The crowd roared for blood, demanding the human be crushed. But Kale refused to fall. He struck when he could, small cuts that seemed meaningless against the champion's bulk. His arms ached, his breath came ragged, but his spirit only burned brighter. At last the beast caught him, slamming him to the ground. His blade skittered across the sand, out of reach. The champion raised its claw, ready to split him in two. The court leaned forward, hungry for the final blow. Lyra's heart stopped in her chest. For a moment she thought it was over, that the spark she had seen in Kale would be snuffed out forever. But Kale was not done. With a cry that echoed like thunder, he rolled, snatched his blade from the sand, and drove it upward with all the strength left in his body. The steel tore into the champion's throat. A spray of alien blood hissed as it struck the hot ground, and the monster collapsed, choking on its own roar. Silence fell. The crowd, once deafening, stared in disbelief. A single human, unarmored and chained, had slain one of their greatest warriors. Then the silence shattered into chaos. Some screamed for his execution, others shouted his name, and still others demanded the Emperor act. But no one could deny the truth. Kale Arden had done the impossible. Dragged back to his cell, Kale's body was battered, his skin torn, but his spirit shone like a star. And though the Emperor plotted his punishment, another truth grew stronger in secret. Kale had become more than a prisoner. He was a symbol of resistance. That night, Lyra could not keep herself away. She slipped through the shadows, past the guards, until she reached his cell. He sat slumped against the wall, his breath heavy, his body trembling. She reached out, her hands shaking, and touched his arm. He flinched, then looked up at her, his eyes still burning with defiance. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped. "If they find you—" "I don't care," she whispered, tears catching in her throat. "You don't understand what you've done. I've never seen anyone fight like that. I've never seen anyone refuse to bow." Kale's eyes softened. He reached for her hand, weak but steady. "Then you've never truly seen a human." Something inside her broke, not with pain, but with release. The walls of obedience, the chains of fear, all fell away in that moment. She laughed through her tears, a sound foreign to her own ears. For the first time in her life, she felt alive. For the first time, she was not just Lyra the servant. She was simply Lyra. But the Empire's shadow loomed large. Kale's victory had not freed him, it had marked him for death. And though Lyra had found courage in his eyes, she knew it might not be enough. The galaxy was vast and cruel, and symbols like Kale were dangerous to those who ruled. If she wanted to keep him alive, she would have to make a choice that would change both their fates forever. Kale's body still carried the marks of the arena, the bruises dark and spreading, the cuts aching with every small movement, but it wasn't the pain that haunted him. It was the memory of the silence that had followed his victory, the hush that had swept across the Valari nobles when they realized a single human had killed their champion. He sat in the shadows of his cell, the rough stone biting against his back, and he could still hear that silence, feel the weight of it. He knew the Emperor would not allow it to stand. To the Valari, symbols were far more dangerous than swords. When the cell door opened with a low groan, Kale expected more guards, another beating, another round of humiliation meant to wear him down. But it was her. Lyra slipped through the bars of light, her movements quick and nervous, her violet eyes scanning the hall before she stepped close to him. In her hands she carried a small bundle of cloth, and when she unwrapped it he saw food, more than he had been given in weeks, and a small flask of water. He wanted to speak, to ask why she risked herself, but the words caught in his throat as she knelt beside him. Her fingers brushed his arm, gentle and trembling, and the warmth of her touch cut deeper than any blade he had faced. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice harsh from thirst. "If they find you—" "I don't care," she interrupted, a sharpness in her tone that surprised even her. "You don't understand. I saw you fight. I saw you stand when no one else would. You should be broken, but you're not." She stopped, swallowing the words that burned in her chest. Her eyes dropped to the floor, but he reached up with a bloodied hand and lifted her chin until she met his gaze. "You've already chosen, haven't you?" he said softly. "You're not theirs anymore." Her breath hitched. For years, obedience had been her shield, her armor against a world that demanded her silence. But now, under his gaze, she felt that shield shatter. She nodded, barely a whisper of movement, but it was enough. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of secrets and shadows. Lyra visited him when she could, always carrying scraps of food, water, or whispers of information she had overheard in the palace halls. She told him of guard rotations, of hidden passages long forgotten, of the Emperor's growing paranoia. And as she spoke, Kale listened not just to the words but to the tremor in her voice, the fragile strength she was beginning to find. She laughed sometimes, softly and carefully, as though rediscovering the sound after years of silence. He found himself living for that laugh, craving it more than food or rest. But the Empire was not blind. Whispers of her disobedience began to spread among the servants. Some avoided her in fear, others watched her with suspicion. One evening, as she carried water through the hall, a noble stepped into her path. His face was pale and sharp, his eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. "They say you spend too much time with a human," he said, his voice a low hiss. "Tell me, has his filth infected you? Do you dream of freedom now, little servant?" Lyra kept her head bowed, her voice calm despite the storm inside her. "I serve the Empire, as I always have." The noble circled her, his robes brushing against the stone floor. "Do you? Or do you serve him?" His hand lashed out suddenly, striking her across the face. Pain blossomed, but she did not cry out. She only lifted her eyes, just enough to meet his. For the first time, she did not look away. The noble faltered, unsettled by the quiet fire in her gaze, and finally spat on the floor before turning away. When she reached Cale's cell that night, the mark still burned on her skin. He touched it with rough fingers, anger flaring in his chest. "They'll kill you for this," he said, his voice low. "They'll kill me anyway," she replied. "But at least this way, I die with my eyes open." He stared at her for a long moment, then pulled her close, their foreheads touching through the bars. "Then we'll make sure neither of us dies alone." It was in that moment, when their breaths mingled in the dark, that the bond between them became unbreakable. But the Emperor was not idle. He had watched the way Lyra's eyes lingered on Cale, the way her silence had shifted into defiance. He summoned her to his throne one morning, the crystalline walls gleaming with cold light. Before her, he placed a blade, its edge sharp enough to gleam like fire. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but every word dripped with venom. "You will kill the human," he commanded. "Here now, in front of us. Prove your loyalty, or die as a traitor." Her hands trembled as she lifted the weapon. The weight of it felt like the weight of her entire life pressing down on her. She had killed before, small, meaningless executions carried out at the Emperor's will, but this was different. This was Cale. This was the man who had shown her that choice was possible, that she was more than chains. She was marched back to his cell, guards at her side, the blade still heavy in her grip. When the door opened, Cale looked up, his expression steady even as his eyes flickered to the weapon. He didn't flinch. He didn't beg. He only studied her, as though he already knew the war raging inside her heart. "So this is it," he said quietly. "They want you to end it." Tears stung her eyes, her chest tight with pain. "If I don't, they'll kill me." Cale nodded, stepping closer. "Then do what you must. But remember, whatever choice you make, it's yours. Not theirs. Yours." The blade shook in her hand. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought the guards outside must hear it. She looked at him, at the man who had fought monsters with nothing but will, at the man who had looked at her not as a servant but as a person. Slowly, her fingers loosened. The blade slipped from her grip and clattered to the ground, the sound echoing like thunder through the cell. Cale's lips curved into a faint smile. "Then you've chosen." The guards rushed in, furious, but Cale moved with the strength of desperation. He caught one by the throat, using his chains like a weapon, snapping bone with brutal precision. Lyra seized the fallen blade and turned it on the second guard, her movements clumsy but fierce. For the first time in her life, she was not carrying out someone else's will. She was fighting for her own. When the last guard fell, their bodies sprawled across the stone, Cale and Lyra stood together in the dim light. Their breaths came ragged, their hands stained with blood, but their eyes shone with something greater than fear. From that night forward, there was no turning back. Blood still clung to Cale's hands, warm and sticky, but his mind was already racing beyond the bodies cooling on the stone floor. The chains on his wrists hung broken, jagged metal scraping his skin, yet he felt lighter than he had in months. Lyra stood beside him, the fallen blade trembling in her grip, her chest heaving with sharp, uneven breaths. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. They only stared at one another, the silence thick with the knowledge of what they had done. There would be no forgiveness now, no mercy. They had crossed the line, and the Empire would never stop hunting them. Cale moved first, snatching the ring of keys from one of the dead guards and unlocking the heavy cell door. The hinges groaned, echoing like a warning through the dungeon halls. He looked back at her, his voice low but steady. "There's no going back. Once we step through, we're enemies of an empire." Lyra's eyes shone with fear, but deeper than that fear was something stronger, resolve. "I was their slave all my life," she whispered. "I'd rather die free at your side than live one more day in chains." They slipped through the corridors, moving like shadows. The palace above was alive with music and voices, the Emperor hosting another of his endless feasts, unaware that the storm he feared was already breaking beneath his feet. Lyra guided Kale through servant passages, narrow stairways carved centuries ago and long forgotten by the nobles who now feasted above. Every turn, every hidden stair, she remembered from years of servitude, and now those memories became their salvation. But escape was never meant to be easy. At the final archway leading out into the night, they found themselves face to face with a squad of armored sentinels. Their leader, a towering Valari captain with eyes like burning coals, raised his weapon with a sneer. "The human lives too long," he growled, "and the servant dares betray her blood. Tonight, both will die." Kale's body screamed with exhaustion, his wounds barely healed, but battle had always been his language. He lunged forward, tearing a spear from one guard's hands and turning it in a deadly arc. Lyra moved with him, the stolen blade flashing in her grip. She had never been trained, but desperation forged its own kind of skill. She fought not with grace but with fury, each strike fueled by years of silence and pain. Together, they moved like a storm, chaotic but unstoppable, carving their way through the sentinels until the floor was slick with blood and only silence remained. The night air hit them like a wave as they stumbled out into the open. Above, the twin moons of Valaris bathed the city in pale light, silver and blue glinting off spires of crystal. For a moment, Kale simply stood and breathed, the cool air burning his lungs. Freedom! It was closer than he had dared to imagine. But Lyra's hand tightened around his. "We can't stop," she said. "The Emperor will know by dawn. His hunters will never rest. If we're to live, we must vanish before the sun rises." So they ran. Through alleys shrouded in shadow, across bridges that gleamed like glass, through markets abandoned for the night. The city seemed endless, every corner another risk, every shadow another threat. Yet with every step, they were together, and that made the impossible bearable. By the time the first light of morning touched the horizon, they had reached the outer walls of the city. Beyond lay the wildlands, forests of black stone and rivers that glowed faintly with bioluminescent light. Few dared to venture there, for the creatures that roamed the wilds were as deadly as any blade. But Kale knew it was their only chance. He turned to Lyra, brushing a lock of silver hair from her face. "This is it," he said. "Once we cross, we're no longer fugitives, we're ghosts. The Empire will hunt us, but here, maybe we can fight back." Her lips curved into a faint, fragile smile. "Then let's disappear together." The wildlands were no sanctuary. Days bled into nights as they pushed deeper into the alien wilderness, hunted not only by the Empire but by beasts with fangs like blades and eyes that glowed in the dark. Kale fought with every ounce of strength he had left, his body a map of scars and bruises, while Lyra learned to fight beside him, her fear hardening into something sharper. She grew stronger with each battle, her hands steadier, her gaze fiercer. Around their small fires at night, when the air hummed with the distant cries of predators, they spoke in whispers. She told him of her childhood, of the day she had been taken from her family and forced into servitude. He told her of the battles he had fought on distant worlds, of the comrades he had buried. They shared stories like stolen treasures, each word building a bridge between them. And slowly, in the midst of fear and blood, something deeper bloomed, a tenderness neither had expected, but both had longed for. It was in those quiet moments, when her head rested against his shoulder and the firelight danced across her blue skin, that Kale realized he was no longer fighting only to survive. He was fighting for her. For them. But empires do not forget. One night, as they camped near the ruins of an ancient outpost, the sky itself seemed to burn. Ships descended from the heavens, their engines roaring like thunder, and from their holds spilled the Emperor's hunters, elite soldiers clad in black armor, their weapons forged to kill swiftly and without mercy. The earth shook beneath their march, and for the first time since their escape, Kale felt the weight of inevitability pressing down upon him. Lyra's hand found his in the dark. "We can't outrun them anymore," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "But we don't have to. You showed me once that a single act of defiance can shake an empire. Let's show them again." They stood side by side as the hunters closed in, the firelight glinting off their blades. Kale raised his spear, his body screaming with pain but his spirit unbroken. Lyra lifted her blade, the glow of the moons catching in her eyes, and together they faced the tide. The battle was chaos, fire and steel and blood crashing in waves around them. Kale fought like a man with nothing left to lose, every strike fueled by a lifetime of defiance. Lyra moved beside him, no longer the trembling servant who had once bowed her head in silence, but a warrior, fierce and unyielding. They cut down enemy after enemy, their bodies battered but their wills unshaken. And then the Emperor himself descended, his form wreathed in dark energy, his voice echoing across the battlefield. "You dare defy me, human? You dare corrupt what is mine?" Kale staggered forward, blood dripping from his wounds, and met the Emperor's gaze without fear. "She was never yours," he spat. "And neither am I." The clash that followed shook the ruins. The Emperor's power was overwhelming, his strikes shattering stone and sending Kale reeling. But every time Kale faltered, Lyra was there, her blade flashing, her voice crying his name, pulling him back from the brink. They fought not as two broken souls, but as one, bound by choice, by defiance, by something greater than chains. At last, with a roar that tore from the depths of his being, Kale drove his spear through the Emperor's chest. The light in the tyrant's eyes flickered, his scream echoing into the night before silence claimed him. The hunters, seeing their master fall, faltered. Some fled, others dropped their weapons in shock. The battlefield fell quiet, the ruins bathed in the pale glow of dawn. Kale collapsed to his knees, his body broken, but Lyra caught him before he fell. She cradled him in her arms, tears streaming down her face, but her voice was fierce. "You're not allowed to leave me now," she whispered. "Not after everything." He managed a weak smile, his hand brushing her cheek. "Then I'll stay," he murmured. "For you." As the sun rose over the wildlands, its light spilling across shattered stone and broken chains, Kale and Lyra stood together. They were fugitives, rebels, survivors. But more than that, they were free. And in their freedom, a spark had been lit that would one day burn across the stars, a fire no empire could ever extinguish.